Hello, and welcome back to another session of Reformed Thinking. I'm your host, and I am ready to get into the text today.
And I'm here as well, definitely looking forward to opening up the scriptures. As always, our goal here is, well, it's simple, but it's significant. We want to look at the Bible through the lens of the sovereignty of God and the doctrines of grace. We stand on the shoulders of the Westminster Confession, holding that God is the primary actor in history and, of course, in our salvation.
That is really the bedrock of everything we do here. You know, usually when we talk about things like sovereignty or monergism, that whole idea that God works alone to save us, we go to the big theological terms. We go to Romans 9, we go to Ephesians 1, we look at the wide-angle lens. But today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to look at one single Hebrew verb.
It's a fascinating approach. Sometimes the biggest theology is hidden in the smallest bits of grammar. The word we're looking at today is shathal.
Shatal. Shin, tav, lamed. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You hear Hebrew verb, and you might be thinking, oh boy, this is going to be dry. But stick with us.
Yeah, please do.
This is not just a vocabulary lesson. This word, shathal, is technically an agricultural term. It means to plant.
That's right. And on the surface, a verb for planting sounds remarkably mundane. You might expect us to discuss farming techniques in the Iron Age.
And we might, a little bit.
We will, a little bit. But this specific word appears in some of the most famous, most memorized passages in the entire Bible.
We're talking Song 1. We're talking Jeremiah 17, the tree by the water.
Correct. But what most people miss in English, because, our translations just say planted, is that shathal carries a very specific nuance. It doesn't just mean to put a seed in the ground. It means to transplant. And that nuance radically alters how we understand spiritual growth.
Okay, that's the hook right there. Because if we are transplanted, that implies a whole lot about where we started and who did the moving.
It certainly does. So our mission today is to do a full survey. We're going to examine every single occurrence of this word in the Hebrew Bible. We're going to look at its roots in the ancient Near East. And we are going to uncover the theological implication that, God is the active gardener who takes his people out of one soil and transplants them into holy ground.
I love it. Let's get our hands dirty. Where do we start? Let's start with the philology, the roots and the nuance of shathal.
So if you open up a lexicon, like Strong's, where it's number 8362, for anyone taking notes, or the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, you'll see it defined as a primitive root, meaning to transplant.
Okay, so make that distinction clear for us. How is shathal different from the other Hebrew words for planting? Isn't there a general word for just sowing seeds?
Yes, absolutely. There's zara. That means to scatter seed. That's the word you get in the parable of the sower, right? You cast seed, and it lands where it lands. But shatal is totally different. It implies working with slips or shoots or rootstocks. You're taking something that's already alive, something that has already sprouted, and you are deliberately placing it into the ground for cultivation.
So it's the difference between a farmer walking across a field, just throwing handfuls of grain, and a gardener who's taking a specific rose bush or an olive shoot, digging a hole, and placing it exactly where he wants it to grow.
That is the perfect analogy. And we know this isn't just a quirk of Hebrew. This meaning is incredibly stable across the entire Semitic language family. If you look at the linguistic neighbors, the cognates, you see the exact same picture.
Walk us through those. It's always good to see that the Bible's language isn't just, existing in a vacuum.
It really isn't. So in Aramaic, a very closely related language, you have the word shatal, same meaning.
Yeah.
In Akkadian, which was the language of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, you have satalu. The big academic dictionaries like the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary list it clearly as to plant.
And Akkadian is old. I mean, that's going back to the time of the exile and even before that.
Very old. Yeah. It shows this word has some strong roots, pun intended. You even see it in Arabic, shatal, which means to plant or transplant. And they have the noun sharat, which means a slip or a cutting.
So across the board, from Babylon to Arabia, this STL root is about moving a living plant to a new home.
Precisely. But here's one of my favorite details from the research. It's a bit of a deep cut, if you will.
Oh, I like a deep cut. Let's hear it.
There's a reference in Punic.
Punic, that's the language of Carthage, isn't it? Hannibal and the elephants.
The very same. Punic is a dialect of Phoenician, which is very close to Hebrew. And there's a citation from a Greek writer, a guy named Dioscurides. He was a physician and a botanist in the Roman army around the 1st century A.D.
Okay.
And he wrote this massive encyclopedia on herbal medicine.
And he mentions a Punic word in this Greek text.
He does. He records a Punic phrase.
Yeah.
Sythil. Now, scholars like the famous Theodore Noel Deck have analyzed this. They break it down as shathil.
And sad usually means field, right? Like in Hebrew, El Shaddai can sometimes be connected to that.
Correct. Field or open country. So shfil sad means shoots of the field or plants of the field. It's using that same root, shathal, to describe the vegetation. It just reinforces that when the biblical authors chose this word, they weren't grabbing a generic term. They were using a technical agricultural term for a cultivated plant.
Okay, so we've established the definition pretty firmly. It's transplanting. It involves a shoot or a slip. Now let's get to the grammar. Because in Reformed thinking, grammar is so often where the theology lives.
It really, really is. When we look at how shathal is used in the Bible, we have to look at the stems or the voices of the verb. And this is where the light bulb should go on.
Okay, so what's the breakdown? How is it used?
The verb appears in what's called the qual stem, the simple active stem. But here's the kicker. It is almost exclusively used in the passive voice.
The passive voice, meaning the subject is receiving the action, not doing it?
Correct. The most common form we find is the qual passive participle, shatul. This is what we find in Psalm 1 and Jeremiah 17. He shall be like a tree planted. The tree is the thing being acted upon. The tree did not plant itself. The tree did not walk over to the river and decide to set down roots. It was shathul. It was transplanted by an outside force.
Wow, that is pure monergism right there in a participle.
It is. Monergism is the doctrine that God is the sole active agent in regeneration. We don't save ourselves, we are saved. We don't plant ourselves in grace, we are planted.
No, there are a couple times where it's active though, right?
Yes, but this just proves the point. Look at who the subject is in those cases. In Ezekiel 17, which we will definitely get to, the text says, I will plant, and the I is God.
Of course.
So linguistically, humans are never the subject of this active verb in a positive spiritual sense. We are never the ones doing the planting. We're always the shathul, the transplanted ones.
That sets the stage perfectly. We're looking at a word that means we are slips, cuttings, taken by a divine gardener and moved to a new location. So let's look at that ideal believer imagery. Let's go to Psalm 1.
Psalm 1, verse 3. Probably one of the first verses many of us ever learned. He is like a tree planted by streams of water.
V'haya kaetz shatul al palshmim.
Beautiful. Now let's focus on that phrase, streams of water, palshmim. In the ancient Near East, you have different kinds of water sources. You have wadis that dry up in the summer. You have rain, which is, unpredictable.
Right.
But peleg, the singular of pelge, it often refers to irrigation canals, channels of water that are dug and directed specifically for agriculture.
So if the tree is shatul transplanted and it's placed by palshmim irrigation canals, this is not a wild tree growing in a forest by accident.
No, this is an orchard. This is a garden. This tree has been placed there on purpose. The location is artificial in the very best sense of that word. It's been moved from the wild, where it might struggle for water, to a place where the water supply is guaranteed by the gardener.
That changes the whole feel of the psalm, doesn't it? It's not just, oh, nature is pretty. It is, God has placed me here. And because of that placement, the text says it yields fruit in its season and its leaf does not wither.
Exactly. The stability comes from the location. And the location was chosen by the planter. It's interesting to look at the Greek translation here, the Septuagint. They use the word phytu, which is the standard Greek word for plant.
Okay.
They didn't quite capture that specific transplant nuance of shathal, but the context makes it clear enough.
Now, Jeremiah 17, verse 8, uses almost the exact same imagery. It's almost a direct quote or a parallel passage.
It is. Jeremiah is contrasting the man who trusts in man, who he says is like a shrub in the desert, with the man who trusts in the Lord. And he says, he is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream.
And again, shatul.
Yes, shathul. And Jeremiah adds a little more detail about the resilience of this tree. He says, it does not fear when heat comes, for his leaves remain green, and is not anxious in the year of drought.
I love that line, is not anxious in the year of drought. And why isn't it anxious? Because it's been transplanted to a source that doesn't depend on the rain.
Precisely. Its roots go down to a constant supply. And here, the Greek Septuagint does something interesting. Instead of just planted for the outcome, some of the Greek texts lean toward this idea of flourishing. The Greek word euthynish appears in some contexts around this verse, and it means to thrive or prosper.
So it highlights the result of the planting.
Yes, exactly. The tree thrives because it's transplanted.
Okay, so we have the tree by the water, but there's another planting location mentioned in the Psalms, Psalm 92.13, or verse 14 in the Hebrew text.
Planted in the house of the Lord, they flourish in the courts of our God.
Shathul again.
Yes, shathulim, it's the plural passive participle. Those who are transplanted in the house of the Lord.
Wow. This is even more specific than by the water. Now we're talking about the temple, the covenant sphere.
It brings out the corporate and, the liturgical aspect of this transplanting. We aren't just transplanted into some private spirituality. We're transplanted into the house of the Lord.
Right.
The text mentions the palm and the cedar in the previous verses. These are majestic, long-lived trees, and they are moved from the wild world, the world of the wicked who spring up like grass and perish, and they are placed into the sacred ground of the covenant.
It really reinforces that idea of separation. To be holy means to be set apart. To be shatul means you were taken out of one place and put into another. You can't be planted in the house of the Lord and still be trying to grow wild in the field.
That's the hard truth of it. The transplanting requires a severing of the old roots. You have to be dug up.
Yeah.
And that leads us perfectly to Ezekiel 17, where this whole metaphor of planting becomes a full-blown narrative.
Ezekiel 17, the parable of the eagles. This is a wild chapter. If you haven't read it lately, it has these great eagles, cedar branches, vines, international politics. It's got everything.
It does. It's a complex allegory about the kings of Judah, specifically King Zedekiah, and their relationships with Babylon and Egypt. But the vocabulary of shathal is absolutely central to the whole thing.
So set the scene for us. What's happening?
So a great eagle, which represents Babylon, comes to Lebanon, takes the very top of a cedar, and carries it off to a land of trade. Then he takes some of the seed of the land and he plants it in fertile soil.
And it grows and becomes a vine.
Yes, a low spreading vine. Verse 8 says, it was planted in good soil by abundant waters. Shatula, there's our word again, passive. It was planted.
Okay, so this sounds good, right? Good soil, abundant water. This sounds like the ideal situation from Psalm 1.
It sounds ideal. It sounds like it should work. But there's a twist. The vine turns its roots toward another great eagle, which represents Egypt, because it's seeking more water. It wasn't content with where the first eagle had planted it.
So it's a story of betrayal. Because of that shifting allegiance, the question in verse 10 is, will it thrive?
Exactly. Behold, it is planted, Shatula. Will it thrive? And the expected answer is a clear no. It will wither when the east wind strikes it.
So what's the lesson there? That being shatul being transplanted is not enough if you don't stay true to the one who planted you. Or is it that this was a political planting by a human king or an eagle representing a king, and therefore it was always doomed?
I think it's both. It shows that even a planted vine can fail if the planting is merely political, or if the vine seeks its sustenance from the wrong source. But the real theological gold is at the end of the chapter. God basically steps in and says, enough with these eagles, enough with these human kings trying to build kingdoms.
And this is verses 22 and 23. This is where we finally get the active voice.
Yes, God speaks. I myself will take a sprig from the lofty top of the cedar and will set it out. And then in verse 23, on the mountain height of Israel will I plant it.
Veshathaltiani.
Veshathaltiani. And I will plant it, I myself. That ani is emphatic. It's there for stress. It highlights God's direct personal intervention.
The human kings failed. The political alliances failed. So God becomes the transplanter.
He does. And the object, what is he planting?
A tender one, a shoot.
He takes a tender one from the topmost of the young twigs, a tender shoot. This is messianic language. The Messiah is often called the branch or the shoot in other prophecies. God takes this tender shoot and transplants it to the highest mountain in Israel.
And what's the result of this planting?
It will bear fruit and become a majestic cedar, and birds of every kind will nest in its shade. It's a beautiful picture of the kingdom of God, a place of refuge for all nations.
And I love the grammar here. You mentioned an unusual form in verse 23.
Yes, it's eshtalennu, I will plant it. It's a form that has a suffix representing the object, it. It's a strong, determined statement of future action. God is essentially staking his reputation on this planting. This is not a passive event anymore. This is the sovereign Lord getting his hands into the soil of history to establish his king and his kingdom.
So you have the passive shathul for the believer in Psalm 1, we are the recipients of grace. And you have the active eshtalennu for God in Ezekiel 17. He is the author of the Messianic kingdom. It fits together perfectly.
It does. It shows that our stability as these little trees in Psalm 1 depends entirely on the success of the great cedar in Ezekiel 17.
Mm-hmm.
We are planted because he was planted.
That is heavy. But,
Yeah.
we have to be honest with the text. Is sheth always a happy word? Is every transplant a transplant to paradise?
Unfortunately, no. And this is where the sovereignty of God becomes a fearful thing, not just a comforting thing. The same hand that plants can also transplant into judgment.
And we see this in Ezekiel 19.
Right. Ezekiel 19 is a lament, a funeral dirge. It picks up that vine imagery again.
Yeah.
Verse 10 describes a mother who was likely Israel or the royal line of David as a vine planted shatul by the water. It was fruitful and full of branches.
So that's referring to the glory days under David and Solomon.
Right. The ideal past. But then, verse 12, but it was plucked up in fury, cast down to the ground, and verse 13 gives us the new condition. Now it is planted in the wilderness, in a dry and thirsty land.
Shatula bamidbar, planted in the wilderness.
And note that word planted. Again, it's still shasul. It didn't just fall there by accident. It was transplanted there.
That is a tough thought. The exile wasn't an accident. It wasn't that God lost control of the situation. It was that God transplanted his people into the wilderness of Babylon.
Correct. The condition of the soil matters tremendously. Being planted is not enough. You need to be planted by the water. When God judges a nation or a person, he can transplant them into a dry and thirsty land. It is an act of sovereign judgment. The roots are still there, the plant is still there, but the environment has been changed to one of scarcity and discipline.
It really challenges that simple idea that we sometimes hear, bloom where you're planted. Sometimes you're planted in a place that's specifically designed to humble you or discipline you.
And that leads us to perhaps the most confusing usage of this word in the entire Bible, Hosea 9, verse 13.
Right, the outline calls this a textual mystery.
It really is. If you open your English Bible, say the ESV or the NRSV, you might read something like this. Ephraim, as I have seen, was like a young palm planted in a lovely meadow.
That sounds nice. Planted in a lovely meadow. Shatula benove.
It sounds lovely. But then the verse continues. But Ephraim must lead out his children to the slaughter. So it's a stark contrast. They were planted for beauty, but they're heading for death.
But there's a big debate about what the Hebrew actually says here, isn't there?
A massive debate. The Hebrew is very, very difficult. The Masoretic text, our standard Hebrew text, seems to say something like planted toward a rock or planted in a pasture. But the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation, read it very, very differently.
What did they have?
They translated it as something like Ephraim has appointed his sons for a hunter or for prey.
Wait, planted in a meadow versus appointed for a hunter. Those are totally different ideas.
They are. The confusion comes from letters and words that look very similar in Hebrew. The critics, scholars like Wellhausen, Jane, Harper, they argue that the text is corrupt, that it's been copied incorrectly over time. They think the word for planted, shatila, might actually be a misreading of a word for set or appointed, shat.
So we might not even have our word shathal here at all.
It's possible we don't. Or if we do, it's being used in a very strange, ironic way.
Yeah.
Planted for a rock, planted toward a sharp edge. It's just very ambiguous.
So how do we handle that as Reformed thinkers? We love the inerrancy and clarity of Scripture, but here we have a significant textual variant.
We handle it by looking at the wider context. Whether the text says Ephraim was planted in a lovely meadow and then squandered that blessing, or that he appointed his children for the hunter as a result of his sin, the theological outcome is the same.
Okay.
Ephraim has abandoned the covenant. Hosea is prophesying the destruction of the northern kingdom by Assyria. So the uncertainty of one particular word doesn't undermine the certainty of the overall message.
So the main point remains clear, regardless of the textual issue.
Precisely. And even if we stick with the Masoretic text, planted in a lovely meadow, it just reinforces the tragedy. God gave them the perfect soil, the promised land. He gave them the perfect location, a neva, a beautiful habitation, and yet they produced fruit that was only fit for slaughter. It's the tragedy of the bad vine all over again.
It's a sobering reminder. The best planting in the world doesn't guarantee faithfulness if the heart turns away.
Indeed.
Okay, let's start to synthesize all of this. We've looked at the word shathal to transplant. We've seen it in the Psalms, in the prophets. We've seen the passive, and we've seen the active.
Let's just break down the stats one more time to lock it in.
Yeah.
The word appears, I believe, 10 times in the Hebrew Bible.
Okay, 10 times.
8 of those times, it's that qual passive form, shathul. The subject is the tree or the vine or the person being planted.
And the other two times.
Ezekiel 17.2 and 23. God is the subject. I will plant.
I just can't get over that ratio. 80% of the time, we're looking at our passive condition. 20% of the time, we are looking at God's active, sovereign intervention. And 0% of the time is man planting himself.
That is the headline. Humans do not plant themselves in righteousness. We don't wake up one day and say, you know what, I think I'll be a cedar in the temple today.
Right. I think I'll just move myself from this desert over to that river.
It's impossible. A tree cannot uproot itself. It requires a gardener. It requires a spade. It requires muscle and intention.
And it requires a slip or a shoot. Let's go back to that definition for a second. You mentioned shitolets, zatum, olive shoots.
Right, from Psalm 128.3. Your children will be like olive shoots around your table. Shted.
An olive shoot is a cutting, isn't it? You have to cut it off an old tree to start a new one.
Yes. And think about the violence of that image, but a violence softened by grace. To become a transplant, you first have to be cut. You have to be separated from the wild stock you came from. And this connects so beautifully to Paul's imagery in Romans 11 about grafting.
The wild olive branch.
Exactly. We were wild olive shoots, cut from the wild tree, and then grafted or transplanted into the cultivated olive tree, which is Israel.
So the very word shathal contains within it the whole story of our salvation. We were wild, we were cut, we were moved, we were planted.
And now we are watered.
And now we are watered.
You know, I want to briefly mention the Greek connections one last time.
Yeah.
Just to give credit to the Septuagint translators. They really did try to capture this.
You mentioned fetouche and euthane.
Yes. Fetouche is the standard plant, but they also used kataphytu in Ezekiel 17, which strengthens it. It means to plant down firmly. And in Ezekiel 17.8, when describing the soil, they use words like pieno, which means to fatten or to enrich. They understood that this was not just any old dirt. This was a fat, rich, cultivated environment designed for growth.
It's a holistic picture. The soil, the water, the act of transplanting, the root system, all of it. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's bring it home for the listener. What does all this mean for the person driving to work or doing the dishes or sitting in their study right now?
I think the main takeaway is about stability. We live in a world that is incredibly unstable. We feel like tumbleweeds sometimes, just blown around by the news cycle, by our emotions, by the economy.
But Song 1 says the righteous man is not like chaff that the wind drives away.
No, he is shatul. He is transplanted. His stability is not found in his own strength or his own ability to grip the dirt. His stability is a result of his location.
Location, location, location.
Precisely. He has been placed by God near the water. And for us, that water is the Word of God and the Spirit of God. If you're feeling dry, if you're feeling withered, the question is not, how do I try harder? The question is, where am I planted? Or maybe have I neglected the stream that God placed me beside?
And realizing that God is the one who put you there brings such a comfort. If God planted you, he intends for you to grow. He didn't transplant you just to kill you.
Unless, of course, you are like the vine in Ezekiel 17 that starts turning its roots toward Egypt. We must be content with the water God provides through his means of grace.
Here's a provocative thought to leave you with. We talked about how shathal means transplanting. And we talked about how that implies we were moved from somewhere else.
Yes.
If we are shathul, that means our original soil was insufficient. It means the wild place we came from was a place of death, even if it felt like home to us.
That's right. The soil of Adam.
I wonder how many of us are still mourning our old soil. I wonder how many of us feel the trauma of the shovel, the pain of being dug up, of having those old roots severed, of being moved to a place that feels unfamiliar, maybe even exposed.
That is a powerful question. We often resent the disruption of God's grace. Being dug up hurts. Being moved from what we knew hurts. But if we could see the streams of water that he's moving us toward, we would understand that the shovel was an instrument of mercy, not malice.
The shovel is an instrument of mercy. I like that. So check your soil, check your roots, and trust the gardener.
Amen to that.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the word shathal. We hope it has enriched your understanding of Scripture and of God's sovereign care for his people.
Until next time, keep digging into the Word.
This has been Reformed Thinking. Soli Deo Gloria.